Chapter 41 of the Deluge, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Deluge, Volume 1 by Henryk Sienkiewicz. Translated by Jeremiah Curtin. Chapter 41. The following day peace reigned at the foot of Yasna Gora, taking advantage of which, the monks were occupied the more earnestly in preparations for defence. The last repairs were made in the walls and the curtains, and still more appliances were prepared to serve in resisting assault. From Zdebov, Korovija, Lagoda, and Grabuvka a number of tens of peasants volunteered, who had served before in the land infantry. These were accepted and placed among the defenders. Kordetsky doubled and trebled himself. He performed divine service, sat in council, neglected the sick neither day nor night, and in the interval visited the walls, talked with nobles and villagers. Meanwhile he had in his face and whole person a calm of such character that one might almost say it belonged to stone statues only. Looking at his face, grown pale from watching, it might be thought that the man slept an easy and sweet sleep. But the calm resignation and almost joy burning in his eyes, his lips moving in prayer, announced that he watched, thought, prayed, and made offerings for all. From his spirit, with all its powers intent upon God, faith flowed in a calm and deep stream. All drank of this faith with full lips, and whoso had a sick soul was made well. Wherever his white habit was seen, there calm appeared on the faces of men. Their eyes smiled and their lips repeated, "Our kind Father, our Comforter, our Defender, our good Hope." They kissed his hands and his habit. He smiled like the dawn and went farther, while around him, above and before him, went confidence and serenity. Still he did not neglect earthly means of salvation. The fathers who entered his cell found him, if not on his knees, over letters which he sent in every direction. He wrote to Wittenberg, the commander-in-chief at Cracow, imploring him to spare a sacred place, and to Yan Kazimir, who in Opola had made the last effort to save a thankless people; to Stefan Charnyetski, held by his own word as on a chain at Sievjes; to Count Veyhard, and to Colonel Svdovski, a Lutheran Czech, who served under Miller, but who, having a noble soul, had endeavored to dissuade the fierce general from this attack on the cloister. Two conflicting counsels were held before Miller. Count Veyhard, irritated by the stubbornness which he had met on November 8th, used all efforts to incline the general to a campaign. He promised him untold treasures and profit. He asserted that in the whole world there were scarcely churches which could be compared with Czestochowa or Yasna Gora. Sadovski opposed in the following manner: "General," he said to Miller, "you who have taken so many famed fortresses that you have been justly named Polichretes by cities in Germany, know how much blood and time it may cost to take even the weakest fortress, if the assaulted are willing to resist unto death." "But the monks will not resist?" asked Miller. "I think just the contrary. The richer they are, the more stubborn a defence will they make. They are confident not only in the might of arms, but in the sacredness of the place, which the Catholic superstition of this whole country considers inviolable. It is enough to recall the German war. How often have monks given an example of daring and stubbornness, even in cases where soldiers themselves despaired of defence? It will take place this time too, all the more since the fortress is not so insignificant as Count Veyhard would like to consider it. It is situated on a rocky eminence difficult for the miner, the walls which, if they were not indeed in good condition, have been repaired before this time; and as to supplies of arms, powder, and provisions, a cloister so rich has inexhaustible supplies. Fanaticism will animate their hearts, and—" "And do you think, gracious Colonel, that they will force me to retreat?" "I do not think that, but I believe that we shall be forced to remain long under the walls. We shall have to send for larger guns than those we have here, and you must go to Prussia. It is necessary to calculate how much time we can devote to Czestochowa, for if his Grace the King of Sweden summons you from the siege for more important affairs of Prussia, the monks will report without fail that you were forced to retreat. And then think, your Grace, What a loss for your fame as Poliocrates will sustain, not to speak of the encouragement which the resisting will find in the whole country. Only," here Sadovski lowered his voice, "let the mere intention of attacking this cloister be noised about, and it will make the worst impression. You do not know, for no foreigner, not a papist, can know, what Czestochowa is to this people. Very important for us are those nobles who yielded so readily, those magnates, the quarter troops, who together with the hetmans have come over to our side. Without them we could not have done what we have done. With their hands we have occupied half the country, nay, more than half, but let one shot fall at Czestochowa, who knows? Perhaps not a Pole will remain with us. So great is the strength of superstition. A new most terrible war may flame up." Miller recognized in his soul the justice of Sadovski's reasoning, all the more since he considered monks in general, and the Czestochowa monks in particular, wizards. That Swedish general feared enchantments more than guns. Still wishing to irritate and maybe prolong the dispute, he said, "You speak as though you were prior of Czestochowa, or as if they had begun to pay you a ransom." Sadovski was a daring soldier and impulsive, and because he knew his value, he was easily offended. "I will not say another word," answered he, haughtily. Miller in his turn was angry at the tone in which the above words were spoken. "I will make no further request of you," said he. "Count Veyhard is enough for me; he knows this country better." "We shall see," responded Sadovski, and went out of the room. Count Veyhard in fact took his place. He brought a letter which he had received from Varshytski with a request to leave the cloister in peace; but from this letter the obstinate man drew counsel directly opposed. "They beg," said he to Miller, "therefore they know that there will be no defence." A day later the expedition against Czestochowa was decided upon at Vyelunie. It was not kept a secret; therefore Father Yatsek Rudnitski, provost of the monastery at Vyelunie, was able to go in time to Czestochowa with the news. The poor monk did not admit for one moment that the people of Yasna Gora would defend themselves. He only wanted to forewarn them so that they might know what course to take and seek favorable conditions. In fact, the news bowed down the minds of the monks. In some souls courage weakened at once, but Kordetski strengthened it. He warmed the cold with the heat of his own heart. He promised days of miracle. He made the very presence of death agreeable, and changed them so much through the inspiration of his own soul that unwittingly they began to prepare for the attack as they were accustomed to prepare for great church festivals, hence with joy and solemnity. The chiefs of the lay garrison, Zamoyski and Charnyetski, also made their final preparations. They burned all the shops which were nestled around the walls of the fortress, and which might lighten an assault for the enemy. The buildings near the mountain were not spared either, so that for a whole day a ring of flame surrounded the fortress. But when there remained of the shops merely the ashes of timbers and planks, the guns of the cloister had before them empty space, unhedged by any obstacles. Their black jaws gaped freely into the distance, as if searching for the enemy impatiently, and wishing to greet them at the earliest moment with ominous thunder. Meanwhile winter was drawing near with swift step. A sharp north wind was blowing, swamps were turned into lumps of earth, and in the mornings water in shallow places was congealed into frail icy shells. The prior, Kordetski, making the rounds of the walls, rubbed his hands blue from cold, and said, "God will send frost to assist us. It will be hard to entrench batteries and dig mines. Meanwhile you will take rest in warm rooms, and the north wind will soon disgust them with the siege." But for this very reason Miller was anxious to finish quickly. He had 9,000 troops, mostly infantry, and 19 guns. He had also 2 squadrons of Polish cavalry, but he could not count on them, first, because he could not employ the cavalry in taking the lofty fortress, and second, because the men went unwillingly, and gave notice beforehand that they would take no part in the struggles. They went rather to protect the fortress, in case of capture, against the greed of the conquerors, so at least the colonels declared to the soldiers. They went finally because the Swedes commanded, for the whole army of the country was in their camp and had to obey. From Vyelunie to Czestochowa the road is short. On November 18th the siege was to begin. But the Swedish general calculated that it would not last above a couple of days, and that he would take the precious fortress by negotiation. Meanwhile Kordetski the prior prepared the souls of men. They went to divine services as on a great and joyous festival, and had it not been for the unquiet and pallor of some faces, it might have been supposed that that was a joyous and solemn thanksgiving. The prior himself celebrated Mass, all the bells were ringing. The services did not end with Mass, for a grand procession went out on the walls. The prior, bearing the Most Holy Sacrament, was supported under the arms by Zamoyski and Pan Pyotr Charnyetski. In front walked young boys in robes; they carried censers with myrrh and incense. Before and after the bald chin marched ranks of white-habited monks, with eyes and heads raised toward heaven, men of various years, from decrepit old men to tender youth who had just begun their novitiate. The yellow flames of the candles quivered in the air, but the monks moved onward and sang, buried altogether in God, as if mindful of naught else in the world. Behind them appeared the shaven temples of nobles, the tearful faces of women, but calm beneath their tears, inspired with faith and trust. Peasants marched also, long-haired, wearing coarse coats, resembling the primitive Christians. Little children, maidens, and boys mingled with the throng, joining their thin voices with the general chorus. And God heard that pouring forth of hearts, that fleeing from earthly oppression to the single defence of his wings. The wind went down, the air grew calm, the heavens became azure, and the autumnal sun poured a mild, pale golden, but still warm, light on the earth. The procession passed once around the walls, but did not return, did not disperse, went farther. Rays from the monstrance fell on the face of the prior, and that face seemed golden and radiant from their light. Kordetski kept his eyes closed, and on his lips was a smile not of earth, a smile of happiness, of sweetness, of exultation. His soul was in heaven, in brightness, in endless delight, in unbroken calm. But as if taking orders from above, and forgetting not this earthly church, the men, the fortress, and that hour then impending, he halted at moments, opened his eyes, elevated the monstrance, and gave blessing. He blessed the people, the army, the squadrons, blooming like flowers and gleaming like a rainbow. He blessed the walls and that eminence which looked down and around upon the land. He blessed the cannon, the guns, smaller and greater, the balls, iron and lead, the vessels with powder, the planking at the cannon, the piles of harsh implements used to repel the assaults of the enemy. He blessed the armies lying at a distance. He blessed the north, the south, the east, and the west, as if to cover that whole region, that whole land with the power of God. It had struck 2 in the afternoon. The procession was still on the walls, but meanwhile on those edges, where the sky and the earth seemed to touch, a bluish haze was spread out, and just in that haze something began to shimmer, to move. Forms of some kind were creeping. At first dim, unfolding gradually, these forms became every moment more distinct. A cry was heard suddenly at the end of the procession, "The Swedes are coming! The Swedes are coming!" Then silence fell, as if hearts and tongues had grown numb. Bells only continued to sound. But in the stillness the voice of the prior thundered, far-reaching through calm. "Brothers, let us rejoice. The hour of victories and miracles is drawing near." And a moment later he exclaimed, "Under thy protection we take refuge, our Mother, our Lady, our Queen." Meanwhile the Swedish cloud had changed into an immeasurable serpent, which was crawling forward ever nearer. Its terrible curves were visible. It twisted, uncoiled; at one time it glittered under the light with its gleaming steel scales; fit another it grew dark, crawled on, emerged from the distance. Soon eyes looking from the walls could distinguish everything in detail. In advance came the cavalry, after it infantry in quadrangles; each regiment formed a long, rectangular body, over which rose a smaller one formed of erect spears. Farther on, behind, after the infantry, came cannon with jaws turned rearward and inclined to the earth. Their slowly moving barrels, black or yellowish, shone with evil omen in the sun; behind them clattered over the uneven road the powder boxes and the endless rows of wagons with tents and every manner of military appliance. Dreadful but beautiful was that advance of a regular army, which moved before the eyes of the people on Yasna Gora, as if to terrify them. A little later the cavalry separated from the rest of the army and approached at a trot, trembling like waves moved by wind. They broke soon into a number of greater and smaller parties. Some pushed toward the fortress, some in the twinkle of an eye scattered through the neighboring villages in pursuit of plunder, others began to ride around the fortress, to examine the walls, study the locality, occupy the buildings which were nearest. Single horsemen flew back continually as fast as a horse could gallop from the larger parties to the deep divisions of infantry to inform the officers where they might dispose themselves. The tramping and neighing of horses, the shouts, the exclamations, the murmur of thousands of voices, and the dull thump of cannon came distinctly to the ears of the besieged, who till that moment were standing quietly on the wall, as if for a spectacle, looking with astonished eyes at that great movement and deploying of the enemy's troops. At last the infantry regiments arrived and began to wander around the fortress, seeking places best fitted for fortification. Now they struck on Częstochowka, an estate near the cloister in which there were no troops, only peasants living in huts. A regiment of Finns, who had come first, fell savagely on the defenceless peasants. They pulled them out of the huts by the hair, and simply cut down those who resisted. The rest of the people driven from the manor house were pursued by cavalry and scattered to the four winds. A messenger was sent with Miller's summons to surrender. He had already sounded his trumpet before the gates of the church. But the defenders, at sight of the slaughter and cruelty of the soldiers in Częstochowa, answered with cannon fire. Now when the people of the town had been driven out of all the nearer buildings, and the Swedes had disposed themselves therein, it behooved to destroy them with all haste, so that the enemy might not injure the cloister under cover of those buildings. Therefore the walls of the cloister began to smoke all around like the sides of a ship surrounded by a storm and by robbers. The roar of cannon shook the air till the walls of the cloister were trembling, and glass in the windows of the church and other buildings was rattling. Fiery balls in the form of whitish cloudlets, describing ill-omened arcs, fell on the Swedish places of refuge. They broke rafters, roofs, walls, and columns of smoke were soon rising from the places into which balls had descended. Conflagration had enwrapped the buildings. Barely had the Swedish regiments taken possession when they fled from the new quarters with all breath, and uncertain of their positions, hurried about in various directions. Disorder began to creep among them. They removed the cannon not yet mounted so as to save them from being struck. Miller was amazed. He had not expected such a reception, nor such gunners on Yasna Gora. Meanwhile night came, and since he needed to bring the army into order, he sent a trumpeter with a request for a cessation. The fathers agreed to that readily. In the morning, however, they burned another enormous storehouse with great supplies of provisions, in which building the Westland regiment had taken its quarters. The fire caught the building so quickly, the shots fell one after another, with such precision that the Westlanders were unable to carry off their muskets or ammunition, which exploded, hurling far around burning brands. The Swedes did not sleep that night. They made preparations, entrenchments for the guns, filled baskets with earth, formed a camp. The soldiers, though trained during so many years in so many battles, and by nature valiant and enduring, did not wait for the following day with joy. The first day had brought defeat. The cannon of the cloister caused such loss among the Swedes that the oldest warriors were confounded, attributing this to careless approach to the fortress, and to going too near the walls. But the next day, even should it bring victory, did not promise glory, for what was the capture of an inconsiderable fortress and a cloister to the conquerors of so many famed cities 100 times better fortified? The greed of rich plunder alone upheld their willingness. But that oppressive alarm with which the allied Polish squadrons had approached this greatly renowned Yasna Gora was imparted in a mysterious way to the Swedes. Some of them trembled at the thought of sacrilege, while others feared something indefinite, which they could not explain, and which was known under the general name of enchantment. Miller himself believed in it; why should not the other soldiers believe? It was noticed that when Miller was approaching the church of Saint Barbara, the horse under him slipped suddenly, started back, distended his nostrils, pricked up his ears, snorted with fright, and refused to advance. The old general showed no personal alarm. Still the next day he assigned that place to the Prince of Hesse, and marched himself with the heavier guns to the northern side of the cloister, toward the village of Częstochowa. There he made entrenchments during the night, so as to attack in the morning. Barely had light begun to gleam in the sky when heavy artillery fire began. But this time the Swedish guns opened first. The enemy did not think of making a breach in the walls at once, so as to rush through it to storm. He wanted only to terrify, to cover the church and the cloister with balls, to set fire, to dismount cannon, to kill people, to spread alarm. A procession went out again on the walls of the fortress, for nothing strengthened the combatants like a view of the Holy Sacrament, and the monks marching forward with it calmly. The guns of the cloister answered, thunder for thunder, lightning for lightning, so far as the defenders were able, so far as breath held out in the breast. The very earth seemed to tremble in its foundations. A sea of smoke stretched over the cloister and the church. What moments, what sights for men who had never in their lives beheld the bloody face of war! And there were many such in the fortress. That unbroken roar, lightnings, smoke, the howling of balls tearing the air, the terrible hiss of bombs, the clatter of shot on the pavement, the dull blows against the wall, the sound of breaking windows, the explosions of bursting bombs, the whistling of fragments of them, the breaking and cracking of timbers, chaos, annihilation, hell. In those hours there was not a moment of rest nor cessation. Breasts half suffocated with smoke, every moment new flocks of cannon balls, and amid the confusion shrill voices in various parts of the fortress, the church, and the cloister were crying, "It's on fire! Water! Water! To the roof with barefooted men! More cloth! Aim the cannon higher! Higher! Aim at the centre of the buildings! Fire!" About noon the work of death increased still more. It might seem that, if the smoke were to roll away, the Swedes would see only a pile of balls and bombs in place of the cloister. A cloud of lime, struck from the walls by the cannon, rose up, and mingling with the smoke, hid the light. Priests went out with relics to exorcise these clouds, lest they might hinder defence. The thunders of cannon were interrupted, but were as frequent as the breath gulps of a panting dragon. Suddenly on a tower, newly built after a fire of the previous year, trumpets began to sound forth the glorious music of a church hymn. That music flowed down through the air and was heard round about, was heard everywhere, as far as the batteries of the Swedes. The sounds of the trumpets was accompanied by the voices of people, and amidst the bellowing and whistling, amidst the shouts, the rattle and thunder of muskets, were heard the words, "Mother of God, Virgin, glorified by God, Mary." Here a number of bombs burst, cracking of rafters and beams, and then the shout, "Water!" struck the ear, and again the song flowed on in calmness. "From thy Son the Lord send down to us, win for us a time of bread, a time of plenty." Kmita, who was standing on the wall at the cannon, opposite the village of Chenstohova, in which Miller's quarters were, and whence the greatest fire came, pushed away a less accurate cannoneer and began to work himself, and worked so well that soon, though it was in November and the day cold, he threw off his fox skin coat, threw off his vest, and toiled in his trousers and shirt. The hearts grew in people unacquainted with war at the sight of this soldier blood and bone, to whom all that was passing, the bellowing of cannon, those flocks of balls, that destruction and death, seemed as ordinary an element as fire to a salamander. His brow was wrinkled, there was fire in his eyes, a flush on his cheeks, and a species of wild joy in his face. Every moment he bent to the cannon, altogether occupied with the aiming, altogether given to the battle, thinking of naught else. He aimed, lowered, raised, at last cried, "Fire!" and when Soroka touched the match, he ran to the opening and called out from time to time, "One by the side of the other." His eagle eyes penetrated through smoke and dust, and when among the buildings he saw somewhere a dense mass of caps or helmets, straightway he crushed it with an accurate shot, as if with a thunderbolt. At times he burst out into laughter when he had caused greater or less destruction. The balls flew over him and at his side; he did not look at anything. Suddenly, after a shot, he sprang to the opening, fixed his eyes in the distance, and cried, "The gun is dismounted! Only 3 pieces are playing there now." He did not rest until midday. Sweat was pouring from him, his shirt was steaming, his face was blackened with soot, and his eyes glittering. Pyotr Charnyetski himself wondered at his aim, and said to him repeatedly, "War is nothing new to you, that is clear at a glance. Where have you learned it so well?" At 3 o'clock in the afternoon a second Swedish gun was silent, dismounted by Kmita's accurate aim. They drew out the remaining guns from the entrenchments about an hour later. Evidently the Swedes saw that the position was untenable. Kmita drew a deep breath. "Rest," said Charnyetski to him. "Well! I wish to eat something. Soroka, give me what you have at hand." The old sergeant bestirred himself quickly. He brought some gorailka in a tin cup and some dried fish. Kmita began to eat eagerly, raising his eyes from time to time and looking at the bombs flying over at no great distance, just as if he were looking at crows. But still they flew in considerable number, not from Chenstohova, but from the opposite side, namely all those which passed over the cloister and the church. "They have poor gunners, they point too high," said Pan Andrei, without ceasing to eat. "See, they all go over us, and they are aimed at us." A young monk heard these words, a boy of 17 years who had just entered his novitiate. He was the first always to bring balls for loading, and he did not leave his place though every vein in him was trembling from fear, for he saw war for the first time. Kmita made an indescribable impression on him by his calmness, and hearing his words he took refuge near him with an involuntary movement, as if wishing to seek protection and safety under the wings of that strength. "Can they reach us from that side?" asked he. "Why not?" answered Kmita. "And why, my dear brother, are you afraid?" "I thought," answered the trembling youth, "that war was terrible, but I did not think it was so terrible. Not every bullet kills, or there would not be men in the world, there would not be mothers enough to give birth to them. I have the greatest fear of those fiery balls, those bombs. Why do they burst with such noise? Mother of God, save us! And they wound people so terribly." "I will explain to you, and you will discover by experience, young father. That ball is iron, and inside it is loaded with powder. In one place there is an opening rather small, in which is a fuse of paper or sometimes of wood." "Jesus of Nazareth! Is there a fuse in it?" "There is, and in the fuse some tow steeped in sulphur, which catches fire when the gun is discharged. Then the ball should fall with the fuse toward the ground, so as to drive it into the middle, then the fire reaches the powder and the ball bursts. But many balls do not fall on the fuse; that doesn't matter, however, for when the fire burns to the end, the explosion comes." On a sudden Kmita stretched out his hand and cried, "See, see! You have an experiment!" "Jesus, Mary, Joseph!" cried the young brother, at sight of the coming bomb. The bomb fell on the square that moment, and snarling and rushing along, began to bound on the pavement, dragging behind a small blue smoke, turned once more, and rolling to the foot of the wall on which they were sitting, fell into a pile of wet sand, which it scattered high to the battlement, and, losing its power altogether, remained without motion. Luckily it had fallen with the fuse up, but the sulphur was not quenched, for the smoke rose at once. "To the ground! On your faces!" frightened voices began to shout. "To the ground! To the ground!" But Kmita at the same moment sprang to the pile of sand, and with a lightning movement of his hand caught the fuse, plucked it, pulled it out, and raising his hand with the burning sulphur, cried, "Rise up! It is just as if you had pulled the teeth out of a dog; it could not kill a fly now." When he had said this, he kicked the bomb. Those present grew numb at the sight of this deed, which surpassed human daring, and for a certain time no one made bold to speak. At last Charnyetski exclaimed, "You are a madman! If that had burst, it would have turned you into powder." Pan Andrei laughed so heartily that his teeth glittered. "But do we not need powder? You could have loaded a gun with me, and after my death I could have done harm to the Swedes." "May the bullet strike you! Where is your fear?" The young monk placed his hands together, and looked with mute homage on Kmita. But the deed was also seen by Kordotski, who was approaching on that side. He came up, took Pan Andrei with his hands by the head, and then made the sign of the cross on him. "Such men as you will not surrender Yasna Gora, but I forbid exposing a needful life to danger. When the firing is over and the enemy leave the field, take that bomb, pour the powder out of it, and bear it to the Most Holy Lady. That gift will be dearer to her than those pearls and bright stones which you offered her." "Father," answered Kmita, deeply moved, "what is there great in that? For the Most Holy Lady I would words do not rise in my mouth. I would go to torments, to death. I know not what I would not do to serve her." Tears glistened in the eyes of Pan Andrei, and the prior said, "Go to her with those tears before they dry. Her favor will flow to thee, calm thee, adorn thee with glory and honor." When he had said this, he took him by the arm and led him to the church. Pan Charnyetski looked after them for a time. At last he said, "I have seen many daring men in my life, who counted no danger to themselves. But this Lithuanian is either the Here Charnyetski closed his mouth with his hand, so not to speak a foul name in the holy place. End of Chapter 41. End of the Deluge, Volume 1, by Henryk Sienkiewicz, translated by Jeremiah Curtin.